There was a deed on the table, not a memory of a deed, not a promise written on a paper napkin, tucked in a Bible, or whispered at the end of a long night. A real deed, county certified, notarized, dated 6 weeks before Harlan Beaumont drew his last breath in the upstairs bedroom of the home his grandfather built. And beside that deed sat a woman who had not come to fight. Nadine Cole sat in the offices of Whitmore and Associates, the kind of law firm where the carpet was the color of old money and the air smelled faintly of cedar and restraint. With her hands folded on the table and her eyes steady as riverstone, she wore a dove-gray blazer. She had pressed it that morning before sunrise, the way she pressed everything, deliberately, with intention. Because the world, she had learned, makes up its mind about you before you open your mouth, and she had decided a long time ago that the world would have to try harder. Warren Beaumont sat across from her. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who took up space in a room as if the room had been designed around him. He wore a suit that had been tailored somewhere expensive. He had driven down from Atlanta that morning in a car that cost more than most people in Harlan County made in 3 years, and he was looking at Nadine the way men like Warren Beaumont looked at women like Nadine Cole, like she was a problem that hadn't been fully categorized yet. The attorney, a quiet man named Gerald Whitmore, who had handled the Beaumont family's affairs for 22 years, cleared his throat softly and opened the folder in front of him. "As you are both aware," Gerald said, "Harlan Beaumont passed away on the 14th of last month. He died at home, as he wished. He was 91 years old." A pause. "He was also, as of 18 months ago, entirely of sound mind and deliberate intention. I want that on the record before we proceed." Warren's jaw tightened, just slightly, just enough for Nadine to notice. She noticed everything. "The amended will," Gerald continued, "names 4 principal heirs, as expected: Warren Beaumont, Marcus Beaumont, Delia Beaumont Ross, James Beaumont, and Celeste Beaumont. However, a separate addendum, executed as a living trust and structured as a property deed transfer, names an additional beneficiary for the primary residence and 11 acres of the estate grounds." Gerald slid a single document across the table. Warren looked at it. Then he looked at Nadine. His voice, when it came, was very quiet, very controlled. The voice of a man who had practiced staying calm in rooms where he was losing. "Sign it back," he said. "Right now, today, and we can all go home like this never happened." Nadine looked at the deed. She looked at her name on it, printed in clean black type. She looked at the signature she knew as well as her own, Harlan Beaumont's hand, still precise at 91, still sure. And then she looked up at Warren Beaumont and said nothing at all. Because a woman who has spent 3 years caring for a dying man, managing his home, protecting his dignity, and absorbing the silence of a family that could not be bothered, that woman does not owe a single word to the son who showed up 48 hours after the funeral and called her the help. If this story has already touched your heart, subscribe now, hit like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. Remember, this is a dramatized fictional story for entertainment only. It does not provide legal, medical, or financial advice. Viewer discretion is advised. Keep watching until the very end, because at minute 15, you'll get a major reveal. To understand why that room mattered so much, you had to go back 3 years. You had to go back to an October afternoon in Harlan County, Georgia, when the air smelled like turned earth, and the pecan trees along the estate road were dropping their leaves in slow, unhurried arcs. When a woman named Nadine Cole drove her 12-year-old Accord through the iron gate of the Beaumont estate for the first time and sat for a moment before she got out, just looking at the house. It was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they have been through something. The main house was 2 stories, white clapboard, with a deep wraparound porch that had been sagging on the south end for at least a decade. The pecan orchard spread to the east, 60 trees, maybe more, their branches interlaced like the fingers of old women who had been standing together too long to let go. There was a barn that had not held animals in 30 years, but still stood with a kind of stubborn dignity. There were 11 acres total, and the county tax records showed a property value that would have stunned most people in Harlan. The Beaumont family had owned that land since 1887. Nadine knew all of this because she had done her research. She was 52 years old when she took the position. She had spent the previous 18 years working as a private estate manager and live-in caregiver for elderly clients, first in Savannah, then briefly in Charleston, then back to the Georgia interior. She had no surviving family she was close to. She had one good friend, a woman named Rosa, who called every Sunday from Augusta. She had a modest savings account she had protected with the ferocity of someone who understood that independence was the only inheritance that could not be contested. She had taken the Beaumont position because the pay was fair, the situation was clear, and because when she spoke to Harlan Beaumont on the phone for 20 minutes before accepting the job, she heard something in his voice that she recognized. A man who had outlived almost everyone who understood him. Harlan Beaumont, at 88, was still sharp, still funny, in a dry, sidelong way that snuck up on you. He had been a civil engineer before he retired, and he still read technical journals out of habit, still kept notebooks filled with observations that nobody asked for. He had been married for 53 years to a woman named Evelyn, who died of a stroke 4 years before Nadine arrived. The 4 children, Warren, Marcus, Delia, and James, were grown, scattered, and largely unavailable in the way that adult children become unavailable when a parent is still functional enough not to require full attention but too old to pretend they don't need any. Celeste was not technically a 5th child. She was Harlan's youngest daughter from a second relationship, a fact the older 4 acknowledged the way you acknowledge weather, as something real, unavoidable, and not entirely welcome. She was 37 when Nadine arrived, and she lived in Savannah, and she called her father every Thursday without fail. Nadine moved into the downstairs guest room in October. By November, she understood the house. By December, she understood the family. And by the following spring, she understood that Harlan Beaumont had been waiting for someone to see him clearly, and had almost given up. The 2 of them developed a rhythm that had nothing performative in it. Mornings, she made coffee, his in a particular mug, white with a faded blue rim that he had used since 1974. She would bring it to the sunroom, where he sat with his notebooks, and she would sit across from him with her own cup, and sometimes they talked, and sometimes they didn't, and the quiet between them was the good kind of quiet, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. He told her things, not because she asked, not because he was lonely enough to talk to anyone, but because she listened in a specific way, attentive without being hungry for it, patient without being passive, and he seemed to recognize the difference. He told her about Evelyn, about the early years when the estate was genuinely a working farm and money was tight enough that they'd skip heating the upstairs in January, about Warren, who had been brilliant and brittle even as a child, and who had left for Atlanta at 22 with ambition blazing out of him like heat off summer asphalt and had never really come back, about Marcus, who stayed geographically close but emotionally distant, running his car dealership in Waycross with the grim efficiency of a man who had stopped expecting joy a long time ago. About Delia, who had her mother's temper and her father's mind and had spent 30 years angry at one or both of them. About James, the 3rd son, who had gone quieter and quieter over the years until some part of him seemed to have simply receded, present in body, somewhere else in spirit. And then Celeste. Harlan's voice changed when he talked about Celeste. It softened in a way that the others didn't produce. Not favoritism exactly, Nadine was careful not to read it that way, but something more like relief. The relief of a parent who worried about all their children but had found in one of them something uncomplicated. There was one afternoon in particular, March 2nd year. The pecan trees were beginning to bud. Harlan had been having a rough week. His balance was worse. He'd had a fall in the hallway that bruised his hip and his pride in equal measure, and he was sitting on the porch in the late light with the particular stillness of a man who has begun to measure his remaining time. Nadine sat beside him. She did not say anything reassuring. She had learned early that Harlan Beaumont did not want to be reassured. He wanted to be accompanied. After a long silence, he said, "You know what none of them understand?" She waited. "This land doesn't belong to whoever gets it," he said. "It belongs to whoever stays with it." She looked at the pecan trees. She said, "That's the kind of thing that tends to make people angry." He turned and looked at her with something that was close to a smile. "Yes," he said, "it is." That was the afternoon he first mentioned the attorney. He did not tell her what he was planning. Not directly. He told her that he had an appointment with Gerald Whitmore the following Tuesday, and that he needed his folders from the upstairs office, and that she should not mention it to anyone. She did not ask why. She retrieved the folders, real estate documents, old deed records, a folder labeled simply Addendum in Harlan's handwriting, and she drove him to the appointment in her Accord, and she waited in the car for 90 minutes while he was inside. When he came back out, he looked tired and satisfied and somehow lighter. He said, "You should know that I've made arrangements." She said, "Okay." He said, "They won't like it." She said, "Is it right?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "I believe it is." She nodded. She started the car. She did not ask what the arrangements were. That was not her place. And Harlan Beaumont, she had learned, would tell her what she needed to know when she needed to know it. What she did not know, what she could not have known in that moment, was that the clock had already started. Because Warren Beaumont had a contact at the county records office, a man named Dale who owed Warren a favor from a real estate deal in 2019. And Dale had noticed that a filing had been made against the Beaumont property, a trust amendment, a deed transfer still in escrow, and had mentioned it offhandedly, the way you mention weather to someone who might care about the forecast. Warren had cared deeply about the forecast. He had not said anything yet. He was a patient man when patience served his interests, but something in him had shifted. That careful, calculating reorientation of a man who senses that a prize he has already mentally deposited may not, in fact, be entirely his. He did not drive down to Harlan County. Not yet. He started watching from a distance. The first time Nadine met Marcus Beaumont in person, he arrived at the estate on a Wednesday afternoon in a truck that needed washing, wearing a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and an expression of resigned competence. He shook her hand with a grip that was businesslike, but not unfriendly. "You're the one keeping the lights on," he said. It was not quite a compliment, not quite not one either. "I try," she said. He walked through the house with the systematic attention of someone doing an inventory. He checked the water heater. He looked at the roof from the side yard. He opened the breaker box in the utility room and stood there looking at it for a moment longer than necessary. Then he came back to the kitchen, accepted a cup of coffee from Nadine, and sat at the table with his father. The conversation between Marcus and Harlan was not warm. It was not cold either. It had the texture of a relationship that had been worn smooth by years of obligation and unspoken disappointment, like river rock. No sharp edges left, but no softness either. Nadine stayed in the background, as she always did. She watched. Marcus, she determined, was a man who cared about the estate as a thing to be maintained, as a responsibility. He did not romanticize it. He did not resent it. He related to it the way he seemed to relate to most of his life, as a series of problems to be managed with minimal drama. His bitterness, when it surfaced, was not directed at anyone in particular. It was the ambient bitterness of a man who had made dutiful choices his entire life and arrived at late middle age, wondering if someone had made off with the part of the transaction that was supposed to include joy. He left that evening with the gutters cleaned and the water heater settings adjusted. He did not hug his father goodbye. Harlan watched his truck go down the estate road and said nothing. Nadine refilled his coffee. Delia came 2 weeks later, and Delia was different. Delia arrived like a weather system. She was 55 years old, broad-shouldered like her father, with close-cropped natural hair and eyes that assessed you frankly and immediately. She was a retired school principal from Columbus, and she carried the residual authority of a woman who had spent decades being the final word in a building full of people who each believed they knew better. She was not cruel. She was sharp. There was a difference, and Nadine had learned to notice it. Delia walked into the house, greeted her father with genuine affection that surprised Nadine after all she'd heard, and then turned that direct gaze on Nadine and said, "You're Nadine. He talks about you. Good things, I hope," Nadine said. "Honest things," Delia said, "which in my family is rarer." They had coffee in the kitchen while Harlan rested, and Delia asked Nadine direct questions about his health, his medications, his mobility, his cognitive state, his daily routine, and his emotional condition. Not challenging questions, informational ones, the questions of someone who wanted real data, not reassurance. Nadine answered all of them honestly. At the end of it, Delia set down her mug and said, "Why are you still here? Seriously, the pay can't be that exceptional." Nadine looked at her. "It's fair. You could get more in Savannah, Atlanta even, probably. So why here? Nadine thought about how to answer that in a way that was true without being more than Delia needed. She said, because he deserves to be somewhere he matters, and I can help with that. Delia looked at her for a moment with an expression Nadine couldn't fully read. Then she said, Lord, you're going to cause a problem when he's gone, aren't you? It was not a question, and it was not unkind. It was the observation of a woman who saw clearly and said what she saw, and it landed in the room with the particular weight of a thing that has already been felt but not yet spoken. Nadine said nothing. The screen door of the back porch creaked and then was still. James Beaumont arrived at the estate not with a knock, but with a silence. Nadine noticed his car in the drive before she realized he had been sitting in it for 20 minutes without coming inside. She watched from the kitchen window, the way you watch something fragile, and eventually he got out and came up the porch steps and opened the door without knocking, the way people do in a house where they grew up. He was 52, same age as Nadine. He had his father's lean build and a quality of stillness that would have been peaceful in someone who was at rest, but in James felt like something else, like a man who had decided at some point to take up as little space as possible, and had been working at it ever since. He was a high school music teacher in Macon, had never married, called his father every other Sunday, visited 3 times a year with a reliability that had all the warmth of punctuality and none of the spontaneity of eagerness. Harlan was asleep when James arrived, and so James sat in the sunroom alone, and Nadine brought him coffee, and they sat together in a silence that was unexpectedly comfortable. After a while, James said, "He's sleeping okay?" "Better than 6 months ago," Nadine said. "His nights are calmer." James nodded. He turned the coffee mug in his hands. He had long fingers, musician's hands, she thought. "You know," he said, "when we were kids, he used to play the radio on Saturday mornings, old gospel stations, not because he was particularly religious, just because he liked the sound of people singing together." He paused. "I haven't heard him play music in years." Nadine said, "I could put the radio on in the morning if you think he'd like it." James looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, but definitely. A small, involuntary softening, like when a muscle you've been holding clenches for so long, you've forgotten it was tense. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think he might." The next morning, Nadine turned on the old radio on the kitchen shelf, the same one Harlan had owned since the 70s, with its amber dial light and its tendency to drift sharp, and found a gospel station out of Savannah and set the volume low enough to be presence rather than intrusion. Harlan came downstairs 20 minutes later, and he stopped in the kitchen doorway, and he listened for a moment, and he did not say anything. But something in his posture released. Nadine put the coffee on. She did not know who had told her to do that. She only knew that it mattered, and that it cost nothing, and that these were the kinds of things that most people forgot to notice. Celeste arrived the following month, driving up from Savannah in a practical silver SUV with a car seat in the back and a toddler on her hip. She was 38, luminous in a way that had nothing to do with youth and everything to do with a woman who had chosen, deliberately, not to be worn down by things she couldn't change. She embraced Nadine before she even got all the way through the door, a real embrace, not a polite one, and said, "Oh, thank you. Thank you for being here with him." Nadine was not usually caught off guard. She was caught off guard. She stepped back and said, "Of course, he's easy to care for." Celeste laughed, a warm, unguarded sound. "He is absolutely not easy, but I appreciate you saying that." The toddler, a girl named Lila, had her grandfather's eyes. She went immediately to Harlan with the fearless certainty of a child who has never been refused, and Harlan lifted her, carefully because his back, and held her with an expression that Nadine had not seen on his face before, an expression of simple, uncomplicated pleasure. That evening, after Lila was down for the night in the small bedroom off the hall, Celeste sat on the porch with Nadine in the dying light, and they shared a glass of iced tea, and Celeste said quietly, "He told me about the changes to the will." Nadine went still. "He didn't give me details," Celeste said quickly. "He told me that he'd made arrangements that were fair and that some of the others might not see them that way at first." She paused. "He said you'd been a good steward." Steward. It was exactly the right word. The word of a man who had spent his life in an engineering mindset, precise, functional, non-sentimental in language, even when sentimental in intent. Nadine said, "I've just tried to do right by him." Celeste turned and looked at her directly. "Whatever he left you, you should keep it. Don't let them bully you out of it." The porch swing creaked once in the evening quiet. Nadine said, "I don't know yet what it is." "I do," Celeste said. And then she picked up her glass and looked out at the pecan trees, dark against the fading sky, and said no more. That night, Nadine lay in her downstairs room and listened to the hum of the old refrigerator and the distant sound of the pecan trees in a light wind, and she thought about Harlan's words on the porch that day in March. It belongs to whoever stays with it. She thought about her savings account, carefully maintained, never extravagant. She thought about her retirement plan, such as it was, cobbled together from years of fair but modest wages. She thought about what it meant to be 52 years old, without children, without a family property of your own, with nothing but your competence and your dignity and the quiet knowledge that you had earned every single thing you had. She did not know what Harlan had put in that living trust. She did not know that Warren Beaumont was already on the phone with his attorney in Atlanta. She did not know that Dale at the county records office had found the deed transfer and that the document sitting in escrow bore her name. She only knew that somewhere in the next year, the old man upstairs was going to stop breathing, and when he did, the house was going to change. She turned off the light. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, tires moved slowly over the gravel of the estate road. A car without its lights on, rolling past the gate, slowing, then moving on. She did not hear it. Harlan Beaumont died on a Tuesday. Nadine had known it was close. She had known it with the particular knowledge of someone who has been in the room with dying before, not as tragedy, but as weather, as inevitability, as something you move through rather than something that moves through you. He had been declining steadily for the last 4 months. His mind stayed clear until near the end, which was both a mercy and a kind of sustained difficulty, because a man like Harlan Beaumont, precise, watchful, proud of his discipline, did not make peace with diminishment easily. He made peace with it the way he made peace with most hard things, by looking at it directly, holding his posture, and refusing to apologize. The last coherent conversation they had was on a Sunday evening. She had brought his coffee, the white mug with the blue rim, and he had taken it and looked at it for a long moment, and then looked at her. "I need you to know," he said, "that I thought about this carefully." She waited. The deed transfer, the trust, all of it. He turned the mug in his hands. "I am not a sentimental man. I never operated on sentiment. I operated on what was right." He paused. "This is right," she said. "I trust your judgment." He looked at her with those clear, tired eyes. "You shouldn't trust anyone's judgment on something this significant, but you can trust the documents. Gerald has everything. It's airtight." He paused. "Warren is going to make noise." "I can handle noise," she said. "Yes," Harlan said. "I know you can. That's why I made the choice I made." He died 4 days later, in the early morning, in his own bed, with the radio playing softly in the kitchen below and the pecan trees barely visible in the gray light outside his window. Nadine called Gerald Whitmore first, then Celeste, then, because they needed to be told, Marcus. She did not call Warren. She let Marcus handle that. She stood on the porch afterward, in the cool morning air, and she allowed herself one long, slow breath before she began the work of what came next. Warren arrived 36 hours after the death, and he arrived with the particular energy of a man who had been planning for this moment for quite some time. He walked through the house with his hands in his pockets and his eyes moving over every surface, the furniture, the bookshelves, the silver candlesticks on the sideboard that had been in the Beaumont family since before the Civil War, with an expression of ownership that he had not yet legally established. He did not acknowledge Nadine when he entered. She noticed this. She made no comment. He found the folders on the desk in the upstairs office, the estate documents, the insurance policies, the utility records, and began sorting through them. When Nadine appeared in the doorway to ask if he needed anything, he looked up and said, "I'm going to need you to start making arrangements to vacate the guest room. We'll need that space." She said, "Mr. Beaumont, there is a reading of the will scheduled with Gerald Whitmore for Thursday. I'd recommend waiting until after that to make any decisions about the house." He looked at her steadily. "I'm familiar with how these things work." "I'm sure you are," she said, and she turned and went back downstairs. Marcus was in the kitchen, drinking coffee from the wrong mug. Anyone's mug, not the white one with the blue rim, which Nadine had quietly washed and placed in the back of the cabinet where it would be safe, and looking out the window at the pecan orchard with that expression of dutiful resignation that seemed to be his permanent condition. He said without looking at her, "Warren's going to be a problem." "Yes," she said. "Did you know about the trust?" She turned and looked at him directly. "I knew your father had made arrangements. I did not know the details." Marcus looked at her then. Something in his expression, not hostile, not warm, but genuinely trying to read the situation. "He trusted you," he said. "It wasn't an accusation. It was almost a question." "He trusted me with his daily life," she said. "That's what I was there for." Marcus nodded slowly. He turned back to the window. After a moment he said, "He wasn't wrong to. You were good to him." It was the closest thing to grace she was going to get from Marcus Beaumont, and she accepted it for what it was. Delia arrived that afternoon, and Delia walked in, looked at Warren's rental car in the drive, looked at Marcus in the kitchen, and said, in a tone of magnificent restraint, "Well, everybody's here." She hugged Nadine, briefly, firmly, and said quietly, "You doing all right?" "Yes," Nadine said. Delia searched her face. "He was good to you?" "He was honest with me," Nadine said. Which was better? Something in Delia's expression registered that, filed it. "Okay," she said. "Okay." James came last, arriving at dusk in his quiet way, sitting in the car for a few minutes before coming in. He found Nadine in the kitchen and stood in the doorway without speaking for a moment, and she handed him a coffee without asking, and he took it, and they stood in the familiar shared quiet. After a while he said, "Did he go peacefully?" "Yes," she said. "He went the way he lived, on his own terms." James nodded. His jaw tightened briefly, then released. "Good," he said. "That's good." That night, all four of them, Warren, Marcus, Delia, and James, were in the house, and the house had a specific electricity that Nadine had felt before in family gatherings around loss. The particular voltage of people who love and resent each other, who share blood and history and property and old wounds, all trying to occupy the same rooms without detonating. She made dinner. She set the table. She served quietly and withdrew. She was not their servant. She was also not foolish enough to perform a role that nobody had assigned her. Warren watched her move through the room with a new expression, something she hadn't seen from him yet. Not dismissal, something more calculated. He was starting to think about her. She felt the shift the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm. That night she lay in her room and listened to the voices moving through the house above her, the particular music of a family negotiating grief and money and history, and she thought about what Celeste had said on the porch. "Whatever he left you, you should keep it. Don't let them bully you out of it." She thought about the deed. She had never seen it. She only knew that it existed, and that it bore her name, and that on Thursday, at the offices of Whitmore and Associates, it was going to enter the room like a lit match. She had 36 hours. The question was not whether Warren was already moving. The question was how far along he was. She found out the next morning. She was in the front hallway, replacing the batteries in the smoke detector, one of those small domestic maintenances that fell to her because it fell to her, because someone had to and no one else was thinking about it. When Warren came down the stairs with his phone to his ear, he walked past her without acknowledgement, went to the front porch, and continued his call. She did not mean to hear. The walls of old houses are porous. Gerald can be pressured, Warren was saying. He's been their attorney for 20 years, but attorneys follow money, and right now money is a unified front from the four of us. If we contest on the grounds of undue influence, a live-in caregiver with daily access to an elderly man in cognitive decline, that's not a frivolous argument. Courts have overturned these before. A pause. No, she doesn't need to know anything before Thursday. She thinks she's attending a reading. Let her think that. Another pause. I have Dale looking into whether the trust filing has any procedural gaps. If there's anything, a signature issue, a notarization that doesn't clear, we stop it before it starts. The screen door opened and closed. Nadine stood in the hallway with the smoke detector in her hands. She was very still. She had worked in private homes long enough to know that the moment you show someone you've heard them is the moment you lose your advantage. She set the smoke detector back in place. She replaced the cover. She went to the kitchen and made coffee and stood at the window looking at the pecan orchard in the morning light. Undue influence, cognitive decline. She thought about the last 4 months, about Harlan's mind, clear, specific, occasionally infuriating in its precision. About the Tuesday before he died, when he had dictated 3 corrections to the estate's property tax filing from memory, without notes, and been right on all 3 counts. About the Sunday conversation, the mug in his hands, the deliberateness of what he had said. He had anticipated this. That was what the living trust was about. Not just the deed transfer, but the structure. Trusts were harder to contest than wills. Gerald had told her that much offhandedly once. She had filed it away without knowing why. Harlan had known why. She went to her room and got her phone and called Rosa in Augusta. Rosa, who had known her for 30 years. Rosa, who had worked as a paralegal before she retired. Rosa, who picked up on the second ring and said, "Nadine, how are you holding up?" "I need you to think through something with me," Nadine said. "Tell me." She kept her voice low. She told Rosa what she knew. The trust, the deed, Warren's conversation, the phrase undue influence, the mention of Dale and procedural gaps. Rosa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is there documentation of his mental state? Medical records, dated communications, anything in writing?" "Gerald will have all of that," Nadine said. "What about your communications with him? Texts, notes?" Nadine thought. Over 3 years, Harlan had occasionally sent her texts, brief, practical messages. "Pick up the cedar mulch at the hardware store. The gutter on the west side is pulling loose. The accountant is coming at 2. She had never thought of them as documentation. She had thought of them as texts. "Yes," she said. "Keep them," Rosa said. "And Nadine, you need your own attorney, not Gerald. Gerald serves the estate, not you. You need someone who represents only you." "I know," Nadine said. "Do you have someone?" She did not, but she knew how to find one. "I'll handle it today," she said. "Call Wanda Jefferson," Rosa said. "She's in Brunswick, does estate and property law. She's good and she's not afraid of old money families." "You know her?" "We worked a case together years ago. She's the kind of woman who walks into a courtroom like the floor owes her money." A pause. "You're going to need that kind of energy on your side." After she hung up, Nadine sat with her phone in her hand for a long moment. She thought about the fact that she was 52 years old, sitting in a house that her name was on a deed to, with 4 Beaumont children upstairs and a clock ticking toward Thursday. She thought about what she had and what she didn't have. She had her name on a legally filed document. She had 3 years of texts and notes and documented routines. She had Harlan's explicit verbal statement on the record of their last real conversation. She had Celeste, who had been told. What she did not have was time to be frightened. She put the phone in her pocket, went to the kitchen, and started a second pot of coffee. When Warren came back in from the porch, she was standing at the counter, calm as a Sunday morning, and she handed him a cup without being asked, and she said, "What time would you like breakfast?" He looked at her. Something shifted in his assessment of her. She felt it, as if he had expected her to show the first sign of the frightened woman he had anticipated, and instead found something he couldn't quite categorize. "8, he said. "Of course," she said. She turned back to the counter. She called Wanda Jefferson at 7:15 a.m. By 8:02, she had an appointment for that afternoon. Wanda Jefferson's office was in Brunswick, 52 miles from Harlan County. It was a clean, spare office with good lighting and a potted fern in the corner that appeared to be genuinely thriving, which Nadine noted as a good omen about the quality of attention paid to things under this woman's care. Wanda herself was 60, dark-skinned, compact, with natural silver locks pulled back and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She shook Nadine's hand with the grip of someone who had been told, a long time ago, that you could lose a room in the first 5 seconds and had decided never to find out. Nadine gave her everything she had, the timeline, the trust, Warren's conversation, Rosa's advice, the texts from Harlan, Gerald's prior comments about trust structures, Celeste's statement about being informed. Wanda listened without interrupting, which Nadine appreciated. She took notes in a precise, economical hand. At the end, she said, "The trust structure is your primary protection. Trusts are significantly harder to challenge than wills because they transfer ownership during the grantor's lifetime, not upon death. If Harlan Beaumont filed this trust before his death while being of sound mind, a contestation based on undue influence would need to demonstrate coercive control, not just proximity and access. He was coherent until 5 days before he died, Nadine said. Do you have medical documentation of that? His doctor would have records. He had cognitive assessments done annually. His choice, not the family's. He was particular about knowing where he stood. Wanda's pen moved. That's significant. A man who voluntarily submits to cognitive testing annually is a man who was monitoring his own competency. That's not the behavior of someone being controlled. That's the behavior of someone who was controlling the situation. Nadine thought of Harlan in the sunroom with his notebooks. Yes, that was exactly right. What about the procedural gaps Warren mentioned? Nadine said. He has someone looking at the trust filing. That's standard pressure strategy, Wanda said. They look for anything. A notarization issue, a date discrepancy, a witness who can be questioned. Most of the time it's noise, but I want to see the filing myself and verify clean execution. She paused. Can you get me a copy of the trust documents before Thursday? Gerald would have them. Gerald represents the estate. He can't share confidential documents with you without authorization. But as a named beneficiary of a living trust, you have a legal right to request a copy of the trust instrument from the trustee. She paused. Who is the trustee? Nadine thought. Gerald. He was named the interim trustee pending distribution. Then you request it directly, in writing, today, as a named beneficiary. He is legally obligated to provide it. Nadine pulled out her phone. Can you tell me exactly what to write? Wanda looked at her over the reading glasses. Something like approval crossed her face. Yes, she said. I can. She drove back to the estate in the early evening with a copy of the formal request letter in her bag and something else, something she hadn't walked in with. Not exactly confidence. Confidence implied she was certain. She was not certain, but certainty was not the same as readiness, and readiness was something she understood. She pulled through the iron gate and up the estate road in the fading light. The pecan trees on either side were very still. The house glowed with interior light. She could see Delia moving in the kitchen, Marcus's truck still in the drive, Warren's rental near the barn. She sat in the car for a moment. She thought about Harlan on the porch. It belongs to whoever stays with it. She thought about what it meant to stay. Not just to stay in a house, but to stay true to something. To hold the line of what was right while the people around you negotiated with what was convenient. She got out of the car and went inside. That night, the family sat around the table for the first time all together, and the meal was quiet in a complicated way. There were undercurrents that moved beneath the surface of polite conversation like cold water under ice. Warren held court at one end with the easy authority of a man who believed the room was his. Delia watched him with an expression that Nadine had learned to read as restrained disagreement on the verge of becoming something louder. Marcus ate with his eyes down. James looked at his food. Celeste, on video call from Savannah because she couldn't come back so soon with Lila, appeared on the small screen propped against the sugar bowl, and her presence, even pixelated, even small, seemed to level something in the room. She asked questions that pulled people back to the actual man rather than the estate. She told a story about Harlan from when she was 12 that made Marcus almost smile. Warren watched the screen with a patience that was not warmth. After dinner, when the table was being cleared, and Warren had gone to the study with his phone, Delia appeared at Nadine's elbow in the kitchen and said quietly, "What are you doing tomorrow?" "Sending a letter to Gerald," Nadine said. Delia looked at her. "You already have a lawyer." It wasn't a question. "Yes," Nadine said. Delia was quiet for a moment. Then, "Good. Warren was on the phone with his Atlanta attorney this morning for 45 minutes. "I know," Nadine said. Delia looked at her steadily. "You heard him. The walls are thin." Delia made a sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite approval, but something in between. She picked up a dish towel and dried a cup. After a moment, she said, "What did my father leave you?" Nadine said, "I'll find out Thursday, same as you." It was true, technically, and Delia seemed to understand the honesty and the strategy in it at the same time. She nodded. She hung up the towel. She said, "Whatever it is, he thought it through. He always thought things through." She turned and walked out of the kitchen. James lingered longest that night. He sat at the kitchen table after everyone else had dispersed, with a half-empty glass of water and that quality of careful stillness. And when it was just the two of them, he said, "He was different the last 2 years. You know that?" "Different how?" Nadine said, though she knew. "Lighter," James said. "Less. He searched for the word. Less like he was carrying something nobody else could see. He looked at his glass. He used to play that record on Sundays, Blind Willie Johnson. He hadn't played it in years. Last summer, you know what I heard when I called? Nadine waited. That record, in the background, like he just put it on because he wanted to. James looked up at her. I don't know what you did, but something got put back in him. Nadine set down the dish towel. She said carefully, he put things back in himself. I just made it easier for him to sit still long enough to do it. James looked at her for a long moment. Something in his eyes that was close to being undone, not by grief for his father exactly, but for all the years he had not allowed himself to be close to something that turned out to be precious. He said, Thank you. She said, Get some sleep, James. Tomorrow's going to need everybody. He stood, rinsed his glass, and went upstairs. She turned off the kitchen light. Outside, the pecan trees were shadows. The porch swing was still. The clock on the kitchen wall read 11:43. Tomorrow was going to need everybody. That was true. But she had already begun to need something that couldn't come from anybody else. She needed to be sure, not of the outcome, which she could not control, but of herself, of the decision that was already made, the line already drawn, the commitment she had made not to Harlan's property, but to his intention. She was going to honor what he chose, not because it made her rich, not because it was convenient, because it was right. And because the only way you live with yourself in the long run is to be the kind of person who does the right thing even when it costs you something. She went to bed. The refrigerator hummed. Gerald Whitmore received Nadine's written request at 9:17 a.m. on Wednesday morning. She had sent it by email with return receipt and also delivered a signed paper copy to his office by 10 a.m. Wanda had advised both methods. The email for speed, the paper for legal record. Nadine had done exactly as instructed. By noon, Gerald had responded. He would provide a copy of the trust instrument as required. He also requested, gently but clearly, that Nadine be present with independent legal representation at Thursday's reading. She emailed Wanda. Wanda replied in 4 minutes. I'll be there. Back at the estate, Wednesday moved through its hours with the particular suspension of time that exists between death and its formal processing. Warren made calls. Marcus checked the orchard fencing. A practical man, finding practical things to occupy himself. Delia organized the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who needed to be doing something concrete. James sat on the porch with a book he wasn't reading. In the afternoon, Warren found Nadine on the back porch and sat down in the chair across from her with the ease of a man who is about to offer something he considers generous. He said, I want to be straight with you. She set down her book. She folded her hands. She waited. My father was a sentimental man in his last years, Warren said. I understand that. And I understand that you were important to his daily comfort, and that deserves to be recognized. He paused. I want to offer you 6 months' salary as a severance, plus a letter of reference from the estate. That is a generous offer, substantially more than most people in your position would receive. She looked at him. She thought about the deed with her name on it. She thought about Harlan's hands folded around the white mug. She said, Thank you for the offer, Mr. Beaumont. He waited. I'll let my attorney respond, she said. Something moved across Warren's face. Not anger, not yet. Something more like recalibration. He had expected the offer to land differently. He had expected her to be either grateful or cornered. She was neither. He said smoothly, I wasn't aware you had retained counsel. Yes, she said. I have. He stood. He smoothed the front of his jacket. I see. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not entirely read, not hostile, not respectful, but something in between that she thought might be the very first moment he was beginning to see her clearly. He went back inside. The screen door closed behind him. She sat on the porch and breathed the afternoon air, the smell of pecan leaves and Georgia red clay and the distant sweetness of something blooming along the fence line. She breathed it slowly. She held it. She let it out. The night before the reading, she could not sleep. She lay in the dark and thought about what she was willing to lose. That was the real question. She had come to understand. Not what you might gain. Any person with ambition could calculate gain. The real question was what you were willing to lose in the fight for it. Your privacy. Your reputation in a small town where gossip moved faster than court documents. The possibility of a quiet exit from a situation that had been, in many ways, good to her. the goodwill of a family who might be more manageable if she simply walked away. She thought about loss. And then she thought about Harlan, about his voice on that porch. It belongs to whoever stays with it. He had not meant only the land. He had meant the principle of it, the commitment, the willingness to stand inside the truth of a thing rather than retreat to the comfortable perimeter of what was expected. She had stayed with him for 3 years. She had stayed when the nights were hard and his pride made him difficult and the loneliness of the work pressed on her. She had stayed when the children failed to call and the house felt enormous and her own life felt like something she had set down carefully in a corner and was not sure she would ever pick back up. She had stayed because it was the right thing and because he deserved it. And now she was going to stay with what he had given her, for exactly the same reasons. She fell asleep around 3 a.m. The refrigerator hummed. The pecan trees were still outside. Thursday morning. She was dressed and ready at 7:30. The dove gray blazer, pressed before sunrise, dark slacks, the small silver earrings that had been her mother's. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror with the directness of a woman who does not require flattery from her own reflection but does require honesty. She looked like herself. That was enough. She drove to Brunswick in the morning light with the radio off and her thoughts organized and her hands steady on the wheel. She was the first to arrive at Whitmore and Associates. The receptionist, a young woman who looked barely 25, showed her to the conference room and brought coffee. Wanda arrived at 8:40 with a leather portfolio and an expression that said she had walked into more difficult rooms than this one and had walked out of all of them. They sat together and reviewed the documents Wanda had been studying since the night before. "The trust is clean," Wanda said. "I've gone through every clause. The notarization is valid, the witnesses are identifiable, and the execution date falls well within the period of his documented cognitive competency. There are no procedural gaps for them to exploit." "Warren mentioned Dale at the county records office," Nadine said. "I know Dale Perkins," Wanda said. "He found the escrow filing, but the trust instrument itself was already registered, and the transfer was already legally initiated. A county records clerk cannot reverse a legally executed trust transfer. He can make noise. He cannot make it matter." She paused. "Warren's going to try the undue influence argument in that room. That's where he'll put his energy." She looked at Nadine. "He's going to imply that you manipulated a vulnerable elderly man. He may say it politely. He may say it in legal language, but that is what he's going to say." "I know," Nadine said. "How do you want to handle it?" Nadine thought. "I'm going to sit still," she said. "I'm going to let Gerald read the documents. I'm going to let Wanda speak for me legally. And I'm going to remember that a woman who gets rattled in that room loses ground she cannot get back." Wanda looked at her steadily. "Exactly right," she said. The Beaumont children began arriving at 9. Marcus first, truck in the lot, face composed, the expression of a man who has decided to receive information before reacting. Delia next, in a crisp blue dress that said she had also dressed deliberately. James, quiet and present. Warren last, with his Atlanta attorney, a man named Clement, tall and silver-templed, with the careful wardrobe of someone who charged by the hour. They filed into the conference room. Warren saw Wanda. His expression adjusted. Something behind his eyes calculated and recalculated. Gerald Whitmore entered, set down his folder, and opened the proceedings with the measured gravity of a man who had been doing this for a long time and had never once found it easy. He read the primary will first. The division of financial assets, savings accounts, retirement funds, investment portfolio, distributed equally among Warren, Marcus, Delia, James, and Celeste, with proportional shares specified. The contents of the house distributed according to a detailed list Harlan had compiled himself, item by item, with characteristic precision. Then Gerald paused. He set down the will and picked up a separate document. "In addition to the primary will," he said, "Harlan Beaumont executed a living trust document approximately 18 months ago, naming me as interim trustee. This document includes a property deed transfer, effective upon Mr. Beaumont's death, for the primary residence and 11 acres of the estate grounds." The room was very still. "The beneficiary named in this transfer is Nadine Cole." Warren said, "I'd like to enter an objection to the trust instrument on the grounds of—" "Mr. Beaumont," Gerald said, with a quiet firmness that years of family law had given him. "I'll ask that you hold your response until I've completed the reading." You'll have full opportunity to speak. Warren's jaw closed. Gerald continued. He read the trust terms. The property transfer was clean, unconditional, and effective. Nadine received the primary residence and the 11 acres including the orchard. She was responsible for the property taxes and maintenance going forward. The 4 primary heirs retained their equal shares of all financial assets. The barn and the outbuildings not included in the 11 acres were to be offered for sale, with proceeds shared equally among the 4. When Gerald finished, the room was a specific kind of quiet. It was the quiet of people who have heard something irreversible. Warren spoke first. This transfer was obtained through a relationship of dependency and influence over an elderly man in decline, Mr. Beaumont. Wanda's voice was precisely controlled. My name is Wanda Jefferson, and I represent Ms. Cole in this matter. I'd like to direct your attention to several documents. She opened her portfolio. First, the annual cognitive assessments conducted by Dr. Patricia Okafor at Harlan Beaumont's own request, the most recent completed 11 months ago, showing full cognitive competency with no evidence of diminished decision-making capacity. Second, a timeline of communications between Mr. Beaumont and Ms. Cole over the past 3 years, including texts, documented household records, and a caregiver log, none of which demonstrate any attempt by Ms. Cole to influence estate decisions. In fact, Ms. Cole was not informed of the specific terms of the trust transfer until this morning. A small pause. Third, Wanda continued, the trust instrument itself, which was executed and notarized in Gerald Whitmore's office with Mr. Whitmore himself as witness, thereby establishing independent legal oversight. The phrase undue influence, when applied to a trust, requires a specific legal standard of proof that is substantially higher than implication or proximity. She paused. If you intend to contest this trust in probate court, you are welcome to do so. I want you to understand the evidentiary landscape clearly before that decision is made. She closed the portfolio. Clement, Warren's attorney, leaned and said something very quietly in Warren's ear. Nadine sat completely still. She did not look at Warren. She looked at Gerald. She kept her hands folded on the table. She let her composure be the only language she needed. The silence stretched. Then Marcus said, not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly, what did he owe her, Warren? Warren looked at his brother. Marcus's voice was the same flat, factual register he used for everything. She was there for 3 years, every day. She drove him to doctor's appointments and managed the property and kept the place running and sat with him when the nights were hard. What did that cost him to acknowledge? You want to put a number on what that's worth? Warren said nothing. Delia said, it's done, Warren. Her voice was steady, not sympathetic, not angry, just final. He made his choice. He had the right to make it. Another silence. Then Warren looked at Nadine. And she held his gaze. She did not look triumphant. She did not look relieved. She looked like what she was, a woman who had expected this and prepared for it and was now sitting inside it with her back straight and her eyes clear. Warren said very quietly, this isn't over. Wanda said, the trust was executed properly with full legal witness and documented competency. If you choose to litigate, the estate will bear the cost of extended probate, and the legal standard for overturning a properly executed living trust is high. She paused. I would recommend consulting with your counsel on the probability of success before committing to that course. Clement leaned in again. Warren sat for a long moment. Then he gathered his jacket and stood. I need to make some calls, he said. He walked out. The room let out a breath. Gerald looked at Nadine with the careful expression of a man who had done his job and was relieved it was done. Ms. Cole, he said, the deed will be transferred and recorded in your name within 30 days. Do you have any questions about the terms? Not at this time, she said. Thank you, Gerald. He nodded. He gathered his documents. He paused before he left and said quietly, he spoke very highly of you, for what it's worth. She said, it's worth quite a lot. The days that followed were not quiet. Warren's Atlanta attorney sent 3 letters over the next 2 weeks, each exploring a different angle of contest. The undue influence argument, a procedural question about the notarization date, a claim about the witnesses. Wanda responded to each one with documentation that closed each angle as it opened. On the 3rd letter, Clement stopped signing them and a junior attorney from his firm signed instead. Wanda said this was telling. On the last day of the third week after the reading, Warren called Nadine directly. She let it ring to voicemail. He called again an hour later. She let it ring again. The third time, she picked up. He said, "I'd like to discuss a settlement." She said, "My attorney handles all communications." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm not calling to threaten you. I want to have a conversation." She waited. "He wasn't himself at the end," Warren said. "You have to understand that. The man I knew, my father, he wouldn't have..." He stopped. A different kind of quiet. Not calculating now. Something rawer. She said, carefully, "Warren, I think the man he was at the end was more himself than he'd been in years. I think that's something you might need to find your own peace with, but I can't help you with that." A pause. He said, "What are you going to do with the place?" "Live in it," she said. "Take care of it, the way someone should." Another pause. Longer. "Fine," he said, and hung up. She put the phone down. She stood at the kitchen window, her kitchen window now, in the legal sense that had always been true in the living sense, and she looked at the pecan orchard in the late afternoon light. 60-some trees. The oldest of them had been planted in the 1940s. Their roots went down into Georgia red clay with the settled permanence of things that have earned their place. She thought about Harlan. She thought about what it meant to stay. Marcus came back to the estate 2 months later, not to challenge anything, just to help. He showed up on a Saturday morning in his truck, looked at the sagging porch on the south end that had needed attention for a decade, and spent the afternoon fixing it. He didn't ask permission. He didn't announce it. He just showed up and worked. When he was done, he stood on the repaired porch and looked at his work with quiet satisfaction. Nadine brought him coffee. He took it without speaking for a moment. Then he said, "The orchard needs attention before fall." "I know," she said. "I was going to hire someone." "I can come back next weekend," he said, not offering exactly, more like stating a probability. She said, "I'll have lunch ready." He nodded. He got in his truck. He came back the following weekend. The weekend after that, Delia came too. It became a rhythm. Not regular exactly, not predictable, but recurring. The way certain things in families recur. Not without cost, not without the memory of everything that had been hard, but genuinely. Delia brought her energy and her directness and her opinion about everything from the fence line to the kitchen organization, and Nadine absorbed and redirected and occasionally pushed back, and this was, she came to understand, exactly the kind of relationship Delia Beaumont was capable of. James came in November, and they sat on the repaired porch in the cool air, and he said he'd been thinking about putting some music back in his life. Real music. Not teaching it, playing it. "What's stopping you?" Nadine asked. He thought about it for a moment. "Not sure anything is," he said. "Anymore." Celeste came for Christmas with Lila, and Lila ran through the house as if she owned it, which in some essential way she already did, the way children claim spaces that feel safe, and the house held them all, and the pecan orchard was bare and beautiful in the winter light. Warren did not come for Christmas. He sent a card, plain white envelope, Beaumont name in the return address. She opened it and it said, "Happy Holidays," and his name and nothing else. She put it on the mantel with the others. Small mercy. Real distance. Mutual acceptance of a complicated truth. 6 months after the reading, Nadine sat on the front porch in the early morning with her coffee in the white mug with the blue rim, which she had retrieved from the back of the cabinet the day after the funeral and had been using since. Not out of sentiment exactly, out of continuity. The pecan trees were leafing out again. The south porch was solid now, the wood still bright where Marcus had replaced the boards. The radio was playing in the kitchen. Gospel station out of Savannah, low enough to be presence rather than intrusion. She had met with a property tax attorney in Brunswick about refinancing the existing lien that had been attached to the estate. Harlan had taken a modest home equity loan in 2019 to repair the roof, and that loan had transferred with the property. She was managing it. The numbers worked if she was careful, and she was always careful. She had a small rental income from the farmhouse at the far end of the property, which she had cleared and leased to a young couple who kept to themselves and paid on time. She was not rich. She was also not precarious, which was, she had come to understand, exactly as valuable. She thought about what had been saved, the house, the land, the trees that had been planted before anyone now alive had been born. She thought about what had been lost, Warren's goodwill, perhaps, though she was increasingly of the view that Warren's goodwill had never been available to her in the first place, that some things appear to be losses that were never actually possessions. She thought about the easier version of the story, the one where she had taken the severance and the letter of reference and gone quietly, and she let herself feel, once, the full weight of what that version had almost cost her. Then she set it down. She thought about Harlan, about a man who had lived long enough and carefully enough and attentively enough to see something in a woman that others had decided not to look for, and to act on what he saw. There was a grief in that, a gratitude wrapped around a grief, because his clarity was real, and his intention was real, and he was gone now, and the house held all of it, the years and the choices and the slow accumulated meaning of people who had lived and argued and loved and let each other down and tried again within these walls. She was the latest in that line, not the end of it. She thought about Celeste's little girl running through the hallways. She thought about James talking about picking up the piano again. She thought about Marcus on the repaired porch, looking at his work with quiet satisfaction, not smiling exactly, but close. Things that had been broken had not been fully repaired. That was the honest truth. Warren had pulled back into a formal distance that was functional, but not warm, and she did not know whether time would soften it or harden it into something permanent. The four siblings had found something among themselves in their father's death that they had perhaps lost in the years of distance and obligation. Not closeness exactly, but contact, recognition. The kind of thing that can only happen when people stop pretending they don't need it. She was a part of that now. Not as a Beaumont, not as someone trying to be a Beaumont, as herself, as the woman who had stayed, who had been trusted, who had held the line of what was right even when it cost her, and who had inherited a piece of Georgia red clay and a stand of pecan trees and an old house with a sagging porch and a history that predated her and would outlast her. That was the truth of it. That was what legacy looked like from the inside. She took a sip of coffee. The gospel music drifted out from the kitchen. The pecan trees moved in the morning light, slow, unhurried, the way old things move when they're not afraid of time. She had no idea what was coming next, but she was not going anywhere. A year after the reading, a letter arrived from Warren's attorney. Not a challenge, not a legal motion, an inquiry. Warren was interested in discussing a potential arrangement for access to the orchard during harvest season, with compensation to Nadine on terms to be mutually negotiated. Wanda's office received it first, as was proper. Wanda called Nadine and said, "He wants back in, not to the property, to the relationship. He's using the orchard as the door because he can't use anything else." Nadine thought about it for 3 days. She thought about pride, his and hers. She thought about Harlan saying Warren had been brilliant and brittle even as a child. She thought about the way people build walls and then become, slowly, prisoners of their own architecture. She thought about what Harlan would have wanted, not out of obligation to Harlan, out of her own considered judgment about what was good. She called Wanda. "Tell them I'm open to discussion, on one condition. Name it. He comes to the house, in person. We talk directly." She paused. No attorneys for that conversation. A beat. "That's not standard," Wanda said. "No," Nadine said. "It's not." Wanda was quiet for a moment. "I'll relay it." Warren came 3 weeks later. He arrived on a weekday morning. He drove himself, not the rental, his own car. He parked and sat in it for a minute before he came up the porch steps, and she watched from the kitchen window and she thought, there he is. That is the real version of this man, the one that drives himself, the one that sits in the car. She opened the door before he knocked. He looked at her. She looked at him. She said, "Coffee?" He said, "Thank you. Yes." They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where his father had sat, where Marcus had stared out the window, where James had turned a coffee mug in his musician's hands, the same table where 3 years of daily living had accumulated into something that looked, from the outside, like nothing much, and was, from the inside, everything. Warren was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I owe you an apology." She waited. "The severance offer," he said. "The way I framed it. The way I handled the reading. He stopped. He was a man who was not accustomed to this kind of sentence, and he was working through it with visible effort. "I made assumptions about what you were and what you wanted, and I treated you accordingly. Those assumptions were wrong," she said. "Yes, they were." He looked at her. Something honest moved across his face. He was happy, he said. Those last years, you should know, when I would talk to him he was different. Lighter? He paused. I told myself it was decline, that he'd gotten easier because he'd gotten simpler. I think I preferred that story to the other one. What was the other one? She said. That he'd found something valuable, Warren said, and that I hadn't been the one to give it to him. The kitchen was quiet. She said, he was proud of all of you. I want you to know that, even when it was complicated. Warren looked at his coffee. He nodded once, slowly, the way a man nods when he hears something he needed and didn't know how to ask for. They talked for an hour. By the end of it, they had not become friends. They had not repaired everything. Some things she knew were not repairable. They could only be acknowledged and worked around, the way you work around a healed fracture that still tells you about weather. But they had found, cautiously, a ground floor, a place to stand from which something more might become possible, in time. He shook her hand at the door. She said, the orchard looks good this year. He said, Dad always kept it right. She said, yes, he did. He went down the porch steps to his car. She stood at the door and watched the dust settle behind him on the estate road, and then she turned back into the house. The radio was playing in the kitchen. The pecan trees were full and green. The white mug with the blue rim was on the counter, washed and waiting. She went to make a fresh pot of coffee. She had work to do. If this story touched your heart, subscribe now, hit like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. It helps us keep sharing stories about strong women, families, and life's unexpected turns. Remember, this is a dramatized fictional story for entertainment only. It does not provide legal, medical, or financial advice. Viewer discretion is advised. See you in the next video.